good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all joining in. Thank you so much for, well, I think it's probably an easy business to stay inside on a night like this. But thank you for joining the Fabian session, and welcome to Deidre. I'm really impressed with, I came across this article, or came across the book, and saw the article that Deidre had written, and it occurred to me that it might make something for us to think about in terms of leadership and our own responsibility for leadership, and the capacity for leadership that we grow in this little political environment of our own. And I was very pleased when I contacted Deidre to be able to get a confirmation that she'd be willing to talk to us, and it brings me great pleasure tonight to introduce her to you all. And welcome, Deidre. Thank you so much for taking your time to prepare for us. There will be a PowerPoint slide, and I'll just ask Deidre to introduce that and go on with I'll start the presentation. Thank you, Deidre.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Rorohini te Monga, ko Manawatu te Awa, ko Fevre Morrison toko hapu. Ko Deidre tako no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for inviting me to join your group tonight. I wish we were in person, but I think I always feel like that, but we'll do our best as a community here online. I'm a professor at the University of Auckland, and my work is in leadership. And tonight I'm going to talk about some work I've done recently, thinking about the leadership of Jacinda Ardern during crisis, particularly during the Christchurch terrorist attacks and the ongoing pandemic. And my work has analysed, trying to understand her decision-making and what's been happening from the perspective of adaptive leadership. Now, I suspect with a group like you, we could actually spend hours debating and analysing her practice, which will be an interesting thing to do. But given that you don't have access to all the data, and that I imagine you're here because you care about the world and you care about change, and your leaders in your own right, I thought it would be more interesting to link it to you as leaders. So what we'll do is I will present some of my work about Ardern, and then we'll have some discussion time, and then I'll present some more work about leadership, and we'll have some discussion time. And I think the most interesting part will actually be you contributing your own ideas as well. So we'll see how that goes. I can see you all in little pictures on my screen here, but do sort of put your hand up if you've got something to say or use the chat, but I will actually stop for discussion as well. So I'm going to share my slides now. Can someone tell me if that looks okay? Can I have a nod?
Yep, that looks good.
Excellent. So tonight I want to talk about adaptive leadership in times of crisis. And this is the structure of what we'll do. I'll begin by talking about what adaptive leadership means. What is it? And I'll draw on research and theoretical ideas there. Then I will talk about my analysis of Ardern's adaptive leadership through crisis, and we'll stop for a discussion. Then we'll talk about developing your own adaptive leadership, what it means for you to develop yourself as a leader, and then we'll have questions and answers at the end. So me talking, discussion, me talking, discussion. Hope that works for you. So leaders today face significant, complex and ongoing problems, and they're leading in spaces where there's disagreement, where there's uncertainty, where there's ambiguity. Some would say, and I think probably rightly so, that it's always been like that. Leadership, especially political leadership, has always been in uncertain and complex times. One of the problems is often when we talk about leadership, we don't recognise the complexity. We don't think about the uncertainty. And that's a key part of what I want to talk about tonight. So my work draws on the work by Heifetz, who's done a lot of work in Harvard. And Heifetz talks about how we have routine or technical challenges in the world, and we have adaptive or complex challenges, the green ones on the right. And I've got a table here which draws from his theoretical work and his work with his colleagues, which shows the difference between these. So a routine or a technical problem can be solved with new information or a new skill set, whereas an adaptive or complex challenge, which is what we're talking about tonight, it can't be fixed, but you can navigate through it. A routine or technical problem is relatively easy to identify. You can kind of figure out what the problem is, whereas an adaptive or complex challenge or problem, it can feel uncomfortable. You might actually even deny or resist the fact it affects, like, for example, problems around issues of racism and equity. They can feel uncomfortable. They can be avoided. That's an adaptive or complex challenge. They might feel uncomfortable. They might be difficult to identify. Routine or technical problems have known solutions, and I put this in bold. Adaptive or complex challenges, such as the ones that had to be addressed in these crises, have no known solution. People might think there's an answer, but there's no known solution. With routine or technical challenges, solutions can be taught. With adaptive complex ones, they usually require changing the way we think and feel and act. And with simple or technical challenges, if you identify a solution and implement it, you'll get results. And with complex challenges in times of crises, you can try possible solutions, but you have to keep experimenting, and you need ongoing inquiry, and you need to evaluate the changing outcomes. Now, one of the problems in the world is we, and I'll say we, whether we're school leaders, because I work a lot in education, whether we're political leaders, whether we're leaders in community, not-for-profit organisations, wherever we are, we often assume that the challenges we face are routine or technical, and we approach them in the manner of the grey area, when in actual fact they're complex challenges. And there isn't a known solution, and they require changing the way we think, feel, and act. And they require a lot of experimenting. So that is the underlying theory that this work comes from, and it's called adaptive leadership. When you are working in the area of complex challenges, adaptive leadership. Now I'm going to move out of politics, I'm going to move out of education to a simple story of learning to drive, because currently I'm teaching my son to drive, and it's one of the scarier things in life, I think, frankly, learning to drive. So adaptive leadership moves in and out of the space of routine and innovative responses. So we would have cognitive overload. We would be exhausted if we were always working on adaptive challenges, if we were always trying to be innovative. We have to be able to draw on automatic responses. And learning to drive is an interesting one, because you may have experienced going to work, going to visit a friend, and you arrive and you don't even really remember driving there, even though you were, because so many things are automatic. You know how to change gears or not change gears or turn the radio on. You can just do it. It's an automatic response because you've had so much practice. However, even driving requires routine and innovative responses, because if you're suddenly in the middle of something like this, or it's the middle of the night, sorry, this is on automatic and it shouldn't be. It's in the middle of the night and it's dark and there's a car in the middle of the road, you need to take innovative response. You need to make a decision fast, and you need to draw on adaptive expertise. So that's kind of an out of the big picture example of how both of these things matter. So the work, as I said, draws on a chapter, and I think you'll be provided with a link in the chat later if you would like to get to this chapter. It's from a book about adaptive leadership in the global economies and perspectives for application of scholarship. It's an international one. This is the only chapter from New Zealand, focusing on Jacinda's leadership. So I'm going to talk about 4 different areas of her leadership, and this work was done by analysing all sorts of data. You know, the 1 o'clock, we remember the broadcasts at 1 o'clock in the afternoon that defined our lives for a period, academic papers, interviews, all sorts of data. And these 4 key ideas came out, and I'm going to talk about each one in turn. That these are practices which may represent what it means to lead during adaptive challenges, complex times, crises. So acknowledging and navigating complexity, mobilizing, communicating, and leading from the stance from empathy, compassion, and kindness. Some of these things you will recognize and have heard before. But first, distributed leadership. So we're going to think about leadership not just as the positional leadership. So Ardern has a positional leadership role, a key role, but there is leadership happening within New Zealand and within the government and across other areas. Networks of influence, such as this picture represents, leadership that is coming from middle leadership. And complexity is interesting. So we're thinking about a complex world here, which is different to a complicated one. So when things are complicated, if you take them apart and you work on something, and then you put it back, you can solve something, you can make progress. When things are complex, if you take something apart and you work on it, by the time you put it back, the whole system's changed. Things are changing all the time. And what we're talking about here is complex systems and complexity. So thinking about leadership and complexity. So one of the key aspects of being able to lead in crises is acknowledging and navigating complexity. So Ardern talked about how problems of racism, violence, and extremism are complex global problems. And thinking about Christchurch, there were lots of things that didn't go right, and I acknowledge that, and there's a big inquiry, and it's very complex. So I'm not here to say it's straightforward or it's simple or it went well at all. But I am here to say, what are some of the things that did happen that were effective? And one may be addressing the systemic enablers. What were the enablers that meant that was possible? And so that is one part of acknowledging and navigating complexity. Another is presenting initially uncertain, ever-changing evidence base for COVID. So rather than, as some world leaders tended to claim, this is how it is, this is what's happening, not being afraid to say, well, we don't actually know, and it's changing on a daily basis. This is the best that we know today. Now, the challenge in society is that we all, as humans, psychology will show us this, want to avoid complexity. We like simplicity. We like to know the answer. There's interesting research to show that we would rather know something was going to happen to us that wasn't that great than not know what was going to happen, even if the chances were something good. We don't like uncertainty. We don't like surprises. So for a leader to acknowledge and navigate complexity, it rubs up against what human nature wants and likes. Another role was mobilizing New Zealanders and indeed influential leaders across international sectors. And as Heifetz would say, adaptive leadership involves mobilizing people, systems, and communities. So in both these cases, particularly with COVID, urgent, sudden, difficult changes needed to be made by everyone. And not everybody was on board, but mobilizing people was a key part of the adaptive leadership. Another part is leveraging and connecting unexpected networks of expertise. And it's kind of interesting why that matters. So if you look back at if you look back at the policy and you look back at who was involved in it and the think tanks, you find to some degree that there's unexpected networks of expertise. Again, you could also critique this and say there were people that weren't involved, that should have been involved. But to a large account, there was a lot of difference. And I'm going to do a bit of an experiment now to talk about why that matters. So you've got a job to do here, and I'm going to give you about a minute. You need to add a line to this to make 6. Some of you have got a couple of people there, so you can do it with someone else, see if you can figure it out. And believe me, this is related to the prior slide. Let's see if anyone can figure this out. Maybe you can kind of wave your hand around if you've got it.
I don't think we can see all the participants with this.
No, all the ones I could see so far, no one's got their hand up yet though. So we'll give you another minute. Okay, so the line that you need to add before this is an S. If you add an S, you've got 6. Now, why do I show you this? Because probably you have a schema that says this is a Roman numeral. How am I going to make this 6? And you can't get out of that. And even though you know it's not working, because you know your Roman numerals, you just can't get out of that schema. So to go back to my previous slide, oops, it's not working. Why is leveraging and connecting unexpected networks of expertise and different perspectives an important strategy? Because people come with different schema, people come with different ideas, different experiences, different theoretical views. And when you can put all of those together, you're going to be more likely to be able to, simple example, problem solve effectively. Two more to talk about. Communicating with clarity amidst uncertainty. So one of the challenges of a leader during a time of crisis and complexity and uncertainty is people want to know, and people need to know some things. How do you do that clearly amidst uncertainty? So one of the things we find when we analyse Jacinda's leadership is there's a lot of explaining reasoning. There's a lot of explaining the reasoning behind actions, the reasoning behind decisions, the reasoning behind policy. We may or may not agree with it, but the reasoning is provided. So transparency about what is known and what is not known. When I look at the leadership through COVID in other countries, it's interesting to see how often claims are made that things are known when actually they're not. And the tension is, as leaders, and you can think about yourself in your own leadership role, we need to be able to inspire confidence in people while maintaining integrity. So I did quite a lot of work with school leaders, and there's this kind of fine balance that if you want to be transparent about what you know and what you don't know, and provide reasoning and be clear about the uncertainty, but not have people freak out and think, I don't think they really know what they're doing. I'm not sure they should be the leader here. What's going on? So it's kind of a tension. It's that vulnerability tension of being able to communicate with clarity and give enough confidence while still maintaining the integrity. And the last one I want to talk about is something that was really being debated and being over and over and over, but the stance of empathy, compassion, and kindness. And back in 2009, and even before that, Heifetz said that addressing adaptive challenges often generates a sense of loss. And a sense of loss is, when you perceive you have something to lose, whether it's your freedom, your well-being, your health, your livelihood, whatever that is. So publicly acknowledging the uncertainty, fear, and anxieties present, according to Heifetz and adaptive leadership, is actually a really important role of a leader. Reframing resistance as perceptions of risk is an interesting one, because quite often resistance is seen firstly as a bad thing when we know actually a lot of social and political movements have happened because of resistance. A lot of good work happens because of resistance. A lot of environmental development happens because of resistance. But resistance can often also be seen as problematic, someone not wanting to give it a go, somebody not engaging. But if we dig a little deeper, we might find there's actually a perception of risk. Somebody's not engaging because they have a perception that there's something they can lose. So reframing it and thinking about that can be useful. I use this a lot in my work in schools because I work with principals who are trying to lead change. And they'll say, oh, the teachers and blah, 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 they're just resistant. They don't want to engage. But actually, when you really have a chance to listen to them and hear them out, you find that maybe they have a perception of risk, that they don't have the skills, or they have an identity of what it means to teach, and this is challenging that. So reframing resistance is an important part. And then the other part in terms of empathy, compassion, and kindness was the effort to avoid external compliance measures to create trust. And we can think about that in terms of COVID. There was a lot of toing and froing and generally trying to avoid, for example, police measures of compliance and to create trust within communities instead. So those are the four. I'll just go back to them on the slide again. No, one before that. Yeah, those are the four key kind of analytical themes that came out of thinking about Ardern's leadership during crisis, thinking about the complexity of it, and thinking about what she did. Now, I just want to remind us again that it wasn't one person. The dangerous thing about analysing leadership is we can tend to focus on one individual. Leadership is a web of influence, and it's happening throughout our systems. So these things are happening by other people in addition. I will move now to some discussion about Ardern's leadership, and then I'm going to move to thinking about your own adaptive leadership and the adaptive leadership of others. So we'll go back to this now. Over to you, Fevre.
Should we take the slides down so we can
That's a
see?
good idea, and then we can see each
screen?
other. Exactly. Great.
Yeah, so other points of discussion, happy to hear them. One of the interesting things I figured that in what you were saying, Deidre, was that we're not quite sure in terms of the relationship between, say, government and government as a political party, government as a coalition, or the civil service, or the academics, or the other communities which are supposed to inform decision-making processes. We're not often sure where the hard work for that research, the evaluation, the collecting of data, the bringing together of literature, where it all happens in a way where it's transparent, and the leader who articulates some of the issues that have come from the literature and from the research communities, where they've got their information from. And
Yeah,
how they've arrived at the decision or the language that they're using to explain the crisis we're in.
and I think that's an important part of the transparency part, having transparency around where it does come from, and also transparency around where it doesn't come from, because often it's the absence that is an important part to understand. I see also what role does courage play? That's a really important question. So courage is a huge part of it, actually, because actually being willing to even be open to the idea that there's an adaptive challenge. So, for example, in education, the idea that we have students who are not achieving as well as other students simply because of race. That is an adaptive challenge. That is a really disturbing challenge. That is one that for many years people have chosen to avoid, or to imagine it doesn't exist, or to think that it's because of something else. It's racism. There's a lot of racism. So what role does courage play? There's courage, first of all, in identifying the existence of a problem. And then there's courage in terms of being willing to be a leader with adaptive leadership when you know there is no answer, when you know there's no thing that you can just try and do, that you're going to have to experiment and try and inquire and bring people on board. And yeah, so I think courage is a really huge part of that. And it's part of it systemically, not just for positional leaders, but for people in the organisations, which you talked about at the beginning, Phil, as well, across the system.
Sue, you've got a question. Turn your mic on, Sue. You're on mute.
Yep. Sorry about that. It isn't a question. I haven't got to that stage yet. Sorry. But I'm absolutely fascinated by this. I think it's really important. I think there's a lot of psychology in it, and a lot of making sure that the things, Deidre, you were pointing out are vital. The things about being open and able to listen to others and able to bring them on board and help them work through the challenges that they may recognise and they may not recognise. Absolutely fascinating. I think I need time to think about it and apply it, but I think it explains an awful lot, and I think it allows a mechanism of enabling growth in all sorts of areas. So thank you. I think it's great.
Thanks.
Jane, you've got a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Really interesting so far. I certainly agree that it's there's a very big psychological component to this. It just reminded me, I don't know if this is very helpful, but it just reminded me that many, many, many years ago, in fact, it was the mid-1970s, I was a nurse, and we used to be told to do stuff, ordered if you like. And sometimes, frankly, the stuff that we were ordered to do seemed ridiculous, like cleaning out a cupboard that you knew damn well had been cleaned yesterday. But we'd have to just do this stuff. But probably towards the end of the 1970s, things started to change. And we had to have rationales for doing things. And this made really a huge difference to me personally. I don't think I was alone, because instead of just being ordered to do things, we had to have a reason why we would go and do cleaning out a cupboard or whatever it might be. And that had two effects. One, it meant that we did things because we could see the good sense of doing it. So it made doing the job, whatever it might be, much more satisfactory. It gave us a reason to be doing something. The other thing, though, is that it made us actually question our practice. And things within nursing did start to shift, where old ways of doing things. I mean, when I started, we had to have pillowcases always facing away from the main door of a ward. We had to have wheels on the bed all pointing the same way. I mean, these are ridiculous things. They didn't help our patients at all. And
so what adaptive leadership would say is that we need some routines. We need routines that make sense,
yes,
but we need to be questioning all the time, does this make sense? And we need to be able to discern when a problem is not a technical, straightforward problem, but it's an adaptive challenge, and we don't currently have ways of responding to it. So we need to work together and create new ways and draw on expertise.
And I think that it was shown by the PM during the various crises that we've had. And it also meant that we were able to talk about what was going on. And I felt I could trust her. And if she made a mistake, that she would probably tell. I think she would have told us. So it increased the level of trust. It's just a point.
Thank you, Jane. Robert, you've got a question.
Sure. I can think of the killing in Christchurch and how Jacinda empathised, and the way she dressed and the way she talked, and she really captured that moment to put across the values that were critical in terms of getting the country alongside of that. So there's one example where her empathising skills in crisis, I think, were very successful. But there have been other crises like the climate crisis and the poverty crisis, where I don't think she's done quite so well. And I wondered if you could comment on why you think she hasn't done quite so well in those sorts of examples.
Yeah, I don't know the answer, but I wonder if part of it is this idea of urgency. So when there's urgency and we perceive it as immediate, it often leads to action. There is actually, as we all know, huge urgency in the climate crisis, huge urgency in the poverty crisis. But maybe it's not in our face quite in the same sense. I don't know. I wonder if that's part of it. Does someone want to jump in on that one? Sorry.
Work going on. It's okay. Did you say?
No, I'm just saying that there is a lot of work in these areas that we don't really see.
Yeah.
We need comments in.
Thank you, Robert. Gary, you had a question too. Jane, you still got a question, or do you want to take your?
Yes, I do. And I want to follow on by Robert's question and the incredible dilemma that climate change presents, because there's such a very, very common consensus that people cannot cope with the actual threats that we are being faced with. So we're getting bureaucratic targets, getting zero by 2050 and this sort of thing. And we're way away from achieving those. There's no sense in the public discussion about really what is going to happen to the world if we don't achieve that. We don't have a clear idea of the enemy that we're trying to address. The scientists have been trying to get this across, but people just don't want to hear. And we've had decades of insulating ourselves from this horrible catastrophe that we're facing, but we don't want to see.
Mm.
And
Can I also
what is
respond to the two chats here? I see that there's a chat about the role of the fourth estate as well, because I think it connects the media. And I think if the media doesn't come from a base, and you can think of examples where they do and when they don't, of understanding complexity and tries to simplify what's being reported and tries to provide it as black and white, there's the right and there's the wrong way, and permanent, like this is the decision and this is, then that contributes to the problem of not having adaptive expertise and adaptive leadership in our society, because we get reports of this is a simple problem and this is what the right or wrong answer is, when it isn't. It's complex. And related to your comment that we just had, that it's going to be a long road and it's going to require different approaches over time. There's also a question there about these days everyone seems to want an immediate answer, a plan, and I think that's interesting too, because people have talked about how psychology is a big part of this adaptive leadership, and it is, and a lot of research will show us that the best planners, the best problem solvers spend more time in the planning phase, spend more time trying to understand the nature of the problem. But humans just like to jump to solutions. We like to jump to solutions fast. And one of the writers, which I find really interesting, is a guy called Tony Wyke, Bryk, B-R-Y-K. And he talks about acting fast and learning slow, and that organizations need to switch that around and act slow and learn fast. There's a couple more in the chat.
Yeah,
there.
Bob's got one, and then iPhone's got one. So let's go to Bob. Bob, you thanks.
Yeah.
Come off.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm sort of interested in a lot of what's been said in terms of explaining complexity and the empathy, which is fine if you reach people. But we're not at a town meeting. We're in this huge audience, often hiding behind social networks of misinformation and fear. There is fear of the left that actually exists, especially in America, with a history of their fear of communism. There's a fear of the left. There's a fear of women, especially women in power. So many people don't see Jacinda as this empathetic woman. They think of someone playing a game to try and control them. And sometimes you have a fear of you're trying to communicate with idiots, which is unkind to the poor idiots that we're trying to communicate with. But that becomes the difficulty. So the mosque crisis, that was immediate, it was clear, it was well explained, the empathy of the action was tremendous. And even the opposition parties had to support the wonder of Jacinda. So they found other things to complain about, like Phil Twyford, until eventually you reach a stage where you deliberately try to build up distrust in a government, which they're doing very effectively. And that produces a problem for the government. No, they can't rush on climate change. They'll be out of power in the next next election. And so that the whole problem with our thing is trying to communicate with idiots, inverted commas, and trying to drive a centrist normal line, where to get the people involved in a communication where you can discuss with them so you understand their opinions and change them. It's very difficult for that to happen. And I don't see how that can happen with a government communicating with a huge, changing, strange and weird audience. You know, like funny old men like me. You know.
Thank you, Bob. iPhone, you've got your hand up. I don't know who you are, but let's see your
Excuse me,
question.
I cannot really open my camera. Sorry, I will just ask one question. I am Kun Kesan from my Young Leadership Program alumni student when I was studying at New Zealand in 2015. Currently, I am just studying English in Australia to do my master degree of international relations. But I just would like to know about, first of all, let's look at about Myanmar political situation. So we have a very political crisis due to the military coup. So I think we need a great leader and very adaptive leader. So I just would like to know what was your suggest in Myanmar case? What kind of leader that we should have in this political crisis that you would like to recommend? Yeah, because I think in this time,
thank you. I think we've got,
yeah. So first of all, I acknowledge the scale of your crisis, and second, I cannot give you an answer because that would be trying to simplify, which is what I'm the opposite to. I'm about understanding the complexity. But what I will say is what I've been talking about here, they're not actually skills, they're not policies, they're ways of being, they're ways of interacting in the world, they're ways of interacting with others. So I think leaders in a crisis such as that, who can embrace these ways of being, are going to have more opportunity to make progress.
Thank you, Deidre. Would you like to now go on to the second part of the?
Sure, that's a good idea.
Yeah, and thank you, iPhone. I appreciate your question coming from abroad.
So we talked a bit about Jacinda Ardern's leadership through crisis. The thing I find empowering about the concept of adaptive leadership is you can think about it in terms of your own leadership, whether that be in a large organisation, in a whānau grouping, in a community organisation. And you can think about it in terms of how you support the adaptive leadership in others. And let's think about young people, children. This is not just about political leaders. So two spheres of influence here. So we're going to move away from Jacinda Ardern to thinking about the underlying concepts of your own leadership and the leadership of others. So this again is from the chapter if you want to read it in more detail, but because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to go relatively quickly. Developing adaptive leadership in yourself and others. First, the important stance is accepting and working with uncertainty. Now, it's easy to read there, it's easy to write, but it's really hard to do, in fact. We like to provide solutions, we like to have the answer, we like to talk. I do a lot of research analysing the conversations that principals have with teachers in schools. And it's really quite surprising for the principals themselves, because if I ask them how they communicate, what they espouse, what they say is, oh, I listen, I want to understand what my teachers are thinking, what their struggles are, that's the stance I come from. So that's what they're wanting, that's what they espouse. When we actually record and analyse what happens, we find principals and leaders in schools spend a lot of time telling other people what should happen, what's going to make a difference, and really not going from a place of uncertainty. So it's interesting that what we think we do isn't the same as actually what we do. So to develop adaptive expertise in ourselves and others, we need to accept and work with uncertainty. It can be uncomfortable, it can be unsettling, it can be all sorts of things, but it's important. Taking time, as I said before, effective problem solvers spend longer trying to identify the nature of the problem. An interesting example was a president of a very large university in the US, and it was a little problem. The little problem was that they had these beautiful gardens. It was an Ivy League, and all the students kept walking across the grass and mulching up all this soil, and it was just a big mess. It was mud. And they tried to put signs up saying that you couldn't walk there, and they tried to put notices everywhere and make announcements, and the students just always walked across the gardens and ruined them. when they took the time to ask the students why they walked across the grounds in ruin, and they found that it was the shortest way to get from one point where the food was to the lecture halls. And so they put paths through and they solved the problem. Well, that's a really simple and tiny problem, a bit like my driving one, but it's just to demonstrate the idea of taking time and understanding the nature of the problem can sometimes lead to relatively simple solutions. I do acknowledge that that is not a complex one. It's not the government in Myanmar, but it's taking time at whatever level can be helpful. Embracing disagreement and discomfort. Now, this may be the hardest one here of any for us. There's a very interesting quote by one of my favorite educational change authors, whose name I've now forgotten, Michael Fullan. And Michael Fullan says, "We learn most from those with whom we disagree, but we spend our lives around those who think the same as us." So we learn most from those with whom we disagree, but we spend our lives around those who are like us. Now, his wording is a little different to that, but that's what it's about. But if you can actually embrace disagreement and not be afraid of it, that is a really key part to adaptive leadership, because before there was conversation about trying to change the views of people, well, actually, first of all, we have to understand what they believe and why. And maybe it totally makes sense what they believe and why. Maybe it doesn't, but embracing disagreement and discomfort is key. There's also interesting research around that one. This was just an aside because I find it amusing, that when people are asked to rate how intelligent a person is, the closer the thinking of that person is to them, the higher they rate them. Don't you like that research? So anyway, embrace disagreement and discomfort. Distribute leadership. Now, that's different to delegation. That's not saying you'll do this and you'll do that and you'll do this. Distributed leadership, according to Jim Spillane, who's one of the key researchers, is really leadership which is networked and based on expertise. So if you go into an organization, such as a school, for example, and you say to people, and I do this, if you want curriculum expertise, where do you go? People will tell you where they go. If you say, if you want to understand Te Ao Māori in a perspective that supports Māori students in the school, where do you go? And people will tell you where they go, and so on. And then you can draw these webs and these networks of influence within the school of where the leadership is in these different areas. And when that's really working well, that's distributed leadership, and people understand where the influence is. Distributed leadership is different to delegating leadership, and it's also different. Well, yeah, distributed leadership matters. That's enough, given how much time we've got. Use adaptive and routine expertise. So remember the example of driving. We can't be adaptive experts. We can't engage in adaptive leadership all the time. We can tell from research that to function, we need stability and change. And if we don't have a certain amount of stability, we get chaos. So using adaptive and routine expertise means using those automatic ways of responding and thinking when they're working, but being aware when they're not. Being aware when we might need to ask, do we actually know what's happening here? Are we responding in the right way? Are we making progress towards resolving this problem, whether the problem is something that can be resolved in a week or something like climate change? Something like climate change, we have to think way beyond our current frames, way beyond trying to change that Roman numeral into another Roman numeral. Two more things to talk about. Navigating perceptions of risk. So that means you can do this a lot for yourself. What's getting in the way of me having a leadership role here? What am I afraid of? What am I afraid of losing? Maybe it is a sense of competence. Maybe it is a sense of collegiality and friendship with others. People might like what I've got to say. Maybe it is a sense of being in control. To really be an adaptive leader, you have to be willing to say, I don't know. I'm not sure. What do you think? But also make decisions. So it's navigating perceptions of risk. And then the final one there, but it's by no means the least important, could be at the top, is developing relational trust. Now, an interesting person who writes about this is Anthony Bryk. His surname is B-R-Y-K. And Anthony Bright did a lot of school and a lot of work in the Chicago public school system. Now, the Chicago public school system was about 20 years ago now, was really in strife. I lived in Detroit at the time, and when I went into schools, I had to go through metal detectors like at the airport. And the Chicago public school system was the same. So I worked in schools across both places. The way they brought about change was developing relational trust all across the networks of people. So not just relational trust between principals and teachers, between whānau, between families and communities and students and the people who came in to work at the school, and teachers and leaders and whānau, and all of these different relationships. And relational trust came from things such as being willing to be vulnerable, being willing to say you don't know, being willing to find out. So what I've done today is a little dangerous, really, because what I'm talking about is the importance of complexity. And what I've done is provided a pretty simplified version of all these theoretical ideas. But I am aware that it's 7:15 and we want to be able to have discussion around this, because I think actually to bring about change, we need to think about what it means for us, how we can take these on. What might we find hard? What might we want to put top of our list to have a go at? What might we want to have on a sticky note on our computer or on the dashboard of our car or on our fridge and think, that's something I'm going to have a go at. So I encourage you to, if you have a chance, have a look at the paper and, have a read about some of these in more detail. We can't do everything at once. So chipping away at a little at a time. I'm going to stop sharing in a second, but my question really is, what does this mean for you? So I'll take that away. But what does this mean for you?
People can put their the yellow hands up if you like. You've got a question?
Representing our story as a football artist, modern cultivate, and in honor of the 50th anniversary.
Sorry, we can't quite hear.
I can't hear.
Sorry, I can't hear if that's a...
Bob Beachy, I think, with his microphone turned off.
No, I've got my microphone on. I don't know where all that noise is coming from. It's probably somebody somewhere that's
someone with them in the back
room. Yeah.
Bob, could you take your yellow hand down if you can? You've got one, unless you have no question.
There might be quite long pauses, and that is fine. Why I'm asking this question is it's easy for us to analyze other people, but it becomes much more challenging when we think about ourselves. So one of the things you might think about from that list is what do I find easiest and what do I find most challenging and why? Now, you don't have to share that with us all now, but just thinking about what you might take away from this at the end of tonight.
One of the things that occurs to me, Deidre, is that I need to learn something of a new vocabulary and maybe even a different tone in my vocabulary. And I'm not quite sure how I practice that or who I practice it on or who's going to give me constructive feedback, because if I'm going to try and change myself from being the old ogre and demonstrative sort of leader that I might have been into something that's more collegial and so on, I'm going to need to have a different language and certainly a different tone to the way in which I frame my conversations.
Yeah, we talk about a tentative stance and using tentative language. So I wonder, it might be perhaps, that's not to say, when Jacinda Ardern was at 1 o'clock telling us the framework of what we need to follow, she didn't say, I wonder if you might stay at home and perhaps you might consider wearing a mask. So there's times and places for that. Yeah. This is not to say decisiveness is not important. Decisiveness is very important. But in terms of when we're trying to understand problems and trying to figure out solutions and approaches, having a more tentative stance might include more perspectives that actually, we couldn't figure out that problem before. That new perspectives will often contribute to problem solving. And we find that actually, I'm not really into the business world, but in the business world, we find that people create diverse work groups on purpose so that they can get different perspectives. So having a language of tentativeness and a language of wondering, a language of open-mindedness.
Bob, your question.
Again, it follows what I was saying before. I agree with everything that's been said. And when in the role of acting principal, I can see, again, with a particular style of community, those rules of leadership are easily applied. I mean, I ignore the messes I made in doing them, but I'm principal. But then when you think again of the wider leadership of trying to lead a country, I mean, that problem of how you actually reach the other side to have that conversation. I mean, I spend the time looking to Labour people. I want to spend more time talking to National people. I got into a long conversation with an ex-student who turned out to be both a Nietzschean and a Trump follower. And we tried to have discussions a long time. Eventually, he just threw me aside and said, I'm not talking to you again because of your ideology. So perhaps I've failed to reach. But the problem is, how can we draw, my hands are waving around again, how can we draw more people in so that these rules can be followed?
Absolutely.
All grow. Thank you.
Absolutely. All I'm doing is nodding. I think you said it. Yes. How can we hear perspectives? How can we hear different? And sometimes it's really hard on us, and sometimes it results like that, but maybe they'll come back again. Who knows? Maybe something was, maybe not.
And Sue, if you turn your mute off.
I think for me, the one that stood out that I need to think about is what are my personal risks? I think, as you said, it's easy to see these things in other people, or easier, but it's not easy to see it in yourself. And if they are real risks, I think they're probably very difficult to look at and face up to and acknowledge so that you can deal with them. On a completely different angle, I've been thinking, I always saw myself as I was going to say a team player. I don't think that's actually what I mean. What I mean is I enjoyed having other people around me to work with. And that was because I felt I was getting a lot of input, as you spoke about earlier. You need people with different perspectives. I suspect that some of that was probably a sense of uncertainty in myself that could be bolstered by hearing other people. So while I think it worked for me, I think that's maybe an area that I need to think about so I can be more constructive.
Thank you. If we go back to the first point you made about the perceptions of risk, we find in organizations when we talk about the role of emotion, because when emotion gets in the way, learning stops, basically. We talk about the role of emotion and we talk about the presence of perceptions of risk. We might not use the language. We might just say, sort of, what are you worried about by changing this? What do you think might happen? What are your concerns? It actually helps people deal with it, because a perception of risk, after all, is a perception. It's not an actual reality. It's real to the person, but it's socially constructed. I'll give you an example. So I used to live in Michigan, and when it snowed at the beginning of winter, all the young kids would come out and go, yay, it's snowing, we get school days off and we get to go skiing. And all the really, really elderly people would peep out and feel fearful because they were worried they were going to slip and they couldn't drive. And so this one phenomena had a completely different perspective for different people. And that's what life is always like, actually. That's, once again, a simplistic example. But perceptions of risk for one person will be different for another. And even having the chance to talk about them and think about them can be empowering.
Thank you, Sue. And Gary, you've got a question. Turn your mute off. Take the mute off, Gary.
Especially a special program to look at leadership within climate change, as you recognize it is a really crucial issue for the community. And there are a lot of different issues and a lot of different roles that need to be managed, from government to local government to various industries, whatever. And then the general community, there's a lot of different challenges there. And I think there's so many issues that need to be sorted out in a way that leadership can work.
And you can think about perceptions of risk too there. I mean, where there's lack of engagement or inactivity, it may not be that people don't understand the problem. It might be that they're a fear of losing their livelihood or a fear of change that, you know, I'm not excusing it, but that might be why. And so being able to understand that can help people engage and go forward.
Okay, I'm impressed with the number of people who are on the screen. Are there any further questions? Any further discussion? Robert, you.
Yes, I mean, you've asked us a personal question about responding, but could I actually turn it back to Jacinda and say, you know, what advice, in the light of all your research, what advice or what changes do you think that she could make to make her a more effective leader?
Oh, that's a huge question, isn't it?
You're the expert, aren't you?
I'm not that big an expert.
But she's off to see world leaders.
You know, there's somebody answering for me. No, that would be good. I don't know. I think it is so complex, again, in terms of the different arenas that she's needing to be effective in and the different expertise she's needing to draw in. I think one of our problems is we like to simplify what the solution is. Why don't you just do this or that? Well, actually, these are huge problems with lots of different enablers. Enablers can be negative things. Things that enable racism are negative things. And being things that enable poverty are negative enablers. Being able to make those transparent. And also, you know, one of the things they said was being okay about being uncertain and uncomfortable and having disequilibrium and discomfort. We're always striving to be comfortable. And actually, it's going to be uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable. It's going to become more uncomfortable with a lot of these things. A lot of us have things to lose that we need to lose to bring about the change. So I feel like real leadership actually isn't positional leadership on one person. It's also how she draws communities and activists and people like yourselves into this as well.
Deidre, one of the interesting things about your topic tonight is the way in which it may have a different place within the different professions which inform practice and conduct practice. I can see some of your issues going down well in professions such as education and those that are involved in training and bringing out the well-being of communities and people and citizens and things, whether that's through physical exercise or encouragement to undertake various tasks. But some professions, and I'm thinking of journalism, for example, tend not to have a voice or a vocabulary which is open to being engaging. They tend to want to say that things are the black and white. They aren't the complex. They aren't the interlinked, but they're either one thing or they're the other. You've either got a policy or you've done a U-turn. You know, you can't be discussing the wider complexity of the issue, because either it's the nature of the occupation, or it's the way in which the industry likes to present its content.
And it's what people want. People don't want to read. Well, people on the screen do, but people typically don't want to read a big narrative about the complexity and the different sides and the different situations. They just want to know. They're in a hurry. They want to know. It's sort of related to the making decisions fast.
Yeah. I mean, some of the journalists that do that sort of work stand out quite clearly. I mean, someone's made reference, I think, in the chat to Matt Nippert for the way he writes. these exploratory analyses that goes behind the scenes of things. There was an incredibly interesting article in the Herald over the weekend by Audrey Young, of all people, on the Ned Fletcher book about the bicultural nature, the version of the treaty that was written in English, and he's just written a full 800-volume book about it. And I think Audrey Young did an amazing job at trying to explain just what is in that book, whereas otherwise it gets reduced down to a question about whether you're for or against the treaty. But in fact, when you read an article as big as that, it's way more complex, and the history is way more nuanced and full of challenges to our common understanding, and we really just aren't sufficiently briefed on what it is that we need to know before we can even enter into these conversations. It's extraordinary how I'm just wondering whether or not some professions are going to be better at making these adaptive changes and taking on adaptive leadership stances than others.
Well, interestingly, the work by Heifetz, the original work, came from very much the business arena, working in businesses. It wasn't from
really
NGOs, it wasn't from political politics or education, it was business. Yeah. Kind of intriguing. So there's a question there about, are there contexts where adaptive leadership is not appropriate? And I think he would say there's not, but there are contexts in that if they're not adaptive problems, we don't need adaptive expertise. Now, if there's a simple answer and we can find it, let's get on with it. Let's be efficient. Let's not make things more complicated than they need to be.
Well, people, there seem to be no further questions, and I really appreciate how much has gone on in the chat, and I appreciate the variety of issues that have been thrown up in the conversations. But really, I just want to go back and thank Deidre for the very constructive way in which she's engaged with her material today. It's taken us from empirical material looking at a particular example, and it's taken us all the way through to thinking about ourselves and our own lives and what we can do to make them better and more improved. Thank you very much, Deidre, for what you've done
Thank you.
and how well you've covered the material today.